Live from the Icebox Studio in Montgomeryville, Pennsylvania, it's the Bill and Corey Show. I'm Bill.
And I'm Corey.
Hey, welcome back to another episode. Last week we talked a lot about regulators. This week, not so much. And of course, we have the YouTube chat set up. So if you have any questions, just send them in and hopefully we'll be able to answer them. Well, we talk about that, but the first question is actually about a pressure regulator.
I was going to say, you're jumping the gun there by saying we're not talking about those today.
Okay, customer needed to limit the maximum flow out of a regulator.
So I had a customer call me and ask me about limiting flow in a regulator. And of course, the first thing I come up with is a rotometer. And then we do this a lot where we're in the delivery, and it comes in and you can control the flow with our rotometer. However, this customer in particular couldn't have any plastic or acrylic in the line. So in that case, we would use steel orifices, and and there's many different sizes. These are 3 separate sizes. One's so small actually you can't even see the hole in it. And so we would put these on here, and for instance, this regulator 3810 will do roughly 200 SLPM under normal conditions. If you slap on a 10,000th size orifice, drops it down to about 4 SLPM. Now I want to add though, this is our typical pressure regulator, and pressure regulators do not do flow regulation. However, we do have flow regulators, and these are typically used for calibration gases. And they are sometimes preset with flows, sometimes you can change the flows, but this is a regulator that is great for trying to help control the flow as well, but not as robust as this one.
Okay, very good. Next question. I'm bringing a regulator out, but it's not about regulators, it's about pressure gauges. Customer said the order was received and does not have the delivery pressure gauge I wanted. I needed a 15 PSI gauge, and what was provided was a 30 PSI one. Okay, so this regulator here has a 30 PSI delivery pressure gauge on here, and it's a minus 30 inch to 0 to 30 PSI. And if you can see the needles up there, that's a 0. So these, we have the vacuum range on there because many customers want to pull a vacuum on to purge their system out.
And what is typically the delivery pressure for this regulator?
Well, this delivery pressure, good point, is 15 PSI delivery pressure. And typically the delivery pressure is going to be in the mid-range of the gauge. So 15 PSI would be up around there. There's a few reasons for that. One is the working pressure of the gauge for steady flow is 3/4 of the range. So if you had a 100 PSI gauge, just easier for math, it'd be 75 PSI as if you're running a steady state system. If you're running steady pressure above that, it's going to lessen the life of the pressure gauge. Now if you have the gauge, and if you're short-term pressure, it can take the full value. So on this regulator, if you're using a 30 PSI gauge, you could take it up to 30 PSI just for a little bit, and it's fine. Nothing will happen with that. And if you have fluctuating pressures in there, like if you have a process that the pressure is just fluctuating back and forth, you want to be 2/3 of the full scale value. Other things that affect the reason why you have it kind of in the middle is what's called droop and lockup. Not so much for droop, but for lockup. So when you have static pressure, if you have 15 PSI static pressure and you start flowing, the pressure is going to go down. That's called droop. And then when you stop the flow, it's going to go back up. And sometimes it goes above the original set point. That's part of lockup. The other is it's called the supply pressure effect. Some people call it pressure regulation. And that's with when you have a single stage regulator, when the cylinder pressure goes down, the delivery pressure will go up. And that's how the forces are balanced out in the pressure regulator. And typically you could see like a 20 PSI rise for when you're going from a full cylinder at above 2,000 down to almost nothing. So you could have, so if you had a gauge, a 15 PSI gauge, and on here, and you don't keep an eye on it, the pressure, cylinder pressure goes down, you can just, the gauge will just go right on up. And I've got a nice video that shows the shows supply pressure effect, and it compares dual stage and single stage regulators. But we can supply a 15 psi gauge on your 15 psi regulator. Some people want that because they're really operating below that, a couple psi, 10 psi, and they want to have the resolution of a 0 to 15 psi gauge. And how we'd handle that is it's a modified regulator, and it would be, we call them dash S's because it would be the part number and with a dash S at the end, and that's how we handle modified pressure regulators. And we
S for modified.
S for S for modified. Yeah. So we could handle it that way, and then it has to go through engineering, and we'll change have the work order change, so we put a 15 psi gauge on there. So we can do that. You can also buy a gauge and swap it out.
And one other benefit of the gauge is that where the accuracy goes, because when you're at the top,
right.
Yes.
Right. One of the other things is the accuracy. Our gauges are typically 323 gauges, so the middle half is plus or minus 2%, and the upper quarter and the lower quarter are plus or minus 3%. Now that's a full scale value. So you have a 100 psi gauge. In the middle, it's going to be plus or minus 2 psi, and in the bottom and upper quarters, it's going to be plus or minus 3 psi. Okay. Okay, so quite be careful with that.
Right.
Here's a question from a customer. He wants to hardwire their PM24 with a transformer incorporated in it.
So this is our PM24.
And what?
It goes with our IPS gauges, our indicating pressure switches. You wire it into it, and you can set the indicating pressure switch to whatever pressure you want for the most part. Typically, we have standard pressures we set them to. When it drops below that pressure, the red light will come on telling you your pressure low on. And typically, this is used with a switch over, so there'll be a left side and a right side. So that's when you know it'll switch over. And inside here is our housing, and the customer wants to know if they want to hardwire it, but unfortunately, this can only take 15 volts DC and needs the transformer on the plug at the end of it to do it. And unfortunately, in the settings they have to try to figure out how to shield the electrical current. And unfortunately, we cannot rewire it to accommodate for that. That's not something we are capable of here. No. However, I'm sure any electrician worth their salt would be able to figure this out just fine. So,
yeah, and well, you can bring 15
you can
VDC in there and then
hardwire. Yes.
Hardwire it
so so if you did have a source that was just 15 volts DC, you could hardwire it right to it, but it has to be the right voltage, or else you'll fry the whole thing, and that's not good.
Okay, next question. Is it okay to use stainless steel tubing with brass compression fittings? So I want to get this. Okay, this is it's a regulator. It's not a regulator question, but it's a regulator. Our brass regulators will have brass compression fittings on the outlet, and that's typically for copper tubing. But if you want to use stainless steel tubing, you can't use the brass ferrules in here. And our compression fittings are 2 ferrules. They have a back ferrule and a front ferrule, and they bite into the tubing. So you need to have the ferrules be the same hardness or harder than the tubing that you're connecting in there. So what you can do is you can use the brass connection on the outlet, and you can even use the brass nut. So if you got stainless steel tubing, you want to use stainless steel ferrules. And we get these from Swagelok, and it's a ferrule set. You can buy the ferrules from our online store, store.mathesongas.com. So we sell the ferrules, so you can buy front and back ferrules. Typically it's 1/4-inch tubing is what we have it set up for. So yes, you can use that with stainless steel tubing. It'll make a great connection. Now we do that on some of our equipment. We have basically, it's mostly brass construction, but we need stainless steel tubing loops in there. And then we'll use brass fittings, and stainless steel ferrules.
And of course, the best material would be diamond, but that was cost prohibitive, so we don't offer that anymore.
No, okay. Okay, we don't have a prop for this question.
I mean, we have a regulator.
Actually, I guess
No, I'm going to use it. I can use it.
Okay.
I'm going to use it for our non-regulator show.
This is more of a gas question. It says, good morning. We are using one of your gas cabinets and regulators to store butane for one of our processes. We've had issues with the We've had no issues with the flow, and the delivery pressure has been steady, but the supply side gas pressure regulator indicator is always showing 0. Is there a problem with the pressure regulator? Could it be damaged or blown out?
Well,
okay, so this is butane they're talking about.
Butane, and that is a very important part of it. Now, if your regulators, the flow's coming out of it is fine and the pressure out of it is fine, it typically wouldn't be the regulator even if that was the case. Now, if gauges can go bad and sometimes they need to be replaced, so that would be the most likely culprit. However, in this case, the gas is the main culprit. Butane has a vapor pressure about 16 psig, and if you remember earlier in the show about how we said the accuracy of the scale is 232, or 323.
323.
And if you have a large 3,000 psig gauge on the end of it, and you go down all the way to 35 psi, or I'm sorry, 16 psi.
Yeah,
2% of 3,000 is about.
No, it's 3% there. So
Oh,
you're
3%
talking 90
yeah,
psi.
yeah,
So it's
about
plus or
90%,
minus 90 psi.
yeah.
So 16, you can't even see it. On
Yeah,
that.
yeah, and if you look at the ticks, you can't even. I mean, there's not even a tick, I think, for a pressure that low. So that is why you are seeing pressure, and it goes back to our last one. If you want, for this one, the CGA for a cylinder with methane is a 510, correct?
Yep.
And that one is a 500 psi CGA, and so we could change out the gauge on it as well and put something smaller in there around 500 or 600 psi gauge to more accurately read the small pressure coming out of the methane, or butane.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Well, that's good. I want to add a little bit
Yeah.
on that. Is that now with butane, it's 16 psi at room temperature, but on a cold day it drops to like nothing, and then in a hot day it might go to like 35 psi. So a pressure gauge really isn't the best way to measure liquefied gases contents. The best way is to measure it by weight. By weighing it, and then you can tell if your cylinder's full or empty.
And we sell scales. Stored.methanesandgas.com.
So that's all the questions we have for this week. Tune in next week at 10 a.m. for another edition of the Bill and Corey Show.
Set your VCRs.